I'd like to introduce the topic of food and ethics by briefly introducing the history of food and ethics. First, let's review what we covered in our first class. This is an anthropology course. What are the four major subfields of anthropology? Do you remember? Cultural, linguistics, archaeology, and biological. We will spend time in this class on how researchers in each subfield intersect with food studies. During the first full week of this course, we will talk about food and ethics. Then we'll spend one day in which we envision our class project on local food resources, local food justice. We'll spend the second week plus one day on theoretical approaches to studying food. In the next several weeks, we'll talk about cultural anthropological issues such as food and identity, food and place, and food and gender. We'll move on to spending a week talking about food studies in biological anthropology, and then food studies in archaeology and history. We'll end by talking about food justice and food security, global food, including biotechnology and genetically modified food, ending with comfort food. Food ethics means different things to different people. Recently, Kaiser and Algiers posit 5 grand challenges connected to food. Food and population growth, food and climate change, food and access to natural resources, food and global health issues, food and the global markets. It was only in 1996, with the publication of the book Food Ethics, that we see the beginning of a new branch of applied or professional ethics on food and ethics. Journals with food ethics articles initially were found mostly in 2 journals, the Journal of Agricultural and Environmental Ethics and Agriculture and Human Values Journal. But starting in 2016, we see a new journal called Food Ethics. Historically, however, ethical concerns about food have revolved around food as a quality that gives life, influenced by notions of temperance or gluttony, and acceptance or rejection of specific foods according to religious laws. During our long history of moral concern with food, we can see a huge difference between pre-modern concerns and modern concerns. Pre-modern concerns with food and ethics revolved around food consumption, private morality, and models for food intake. Whereas today, we are more concerned with food production, an emphasis on social dimensions, and food related to ideological and social conflicts. For example, food choice may be an explicitly ethic or political act. Overall, food systems are what we call wickedly complex. Let's start with looking at Greek dietetics. The basic maxim of Greek morality was to live and act in accordance with nature. You should live a life of temperance, and dietetic refers to the art of temperance. To do so, you must thoughtfully select and prepare the food that you eat. The Hebrew Bible puts forth a basic distinction between what is allowed and what is not allowed to be eaten, what is permitted, what is prohibited, what is admissible, what is inadmissible, what is legitimate, and what is illicit food. We'll be reading Mary Douglas, Deciphering a Meal, in which she talks about the Jewish rules concerning meat. As she points out, certain animal kinds are unfit for eating, but of those animals admitted as edible, there should be total separation of meat from blood before cooking and total separation of meat from milk. The Hebrew Bible values purity and rejects impurity, and it sets boundaries for the area of structured relations, and within that area, rules apply. According to the ancient Christian Gospels, food intake is not related to one's moral identity, and no food is unclean in itself. During the medieval and Renaissance periods, initially food in itself was unimportant from a moral sense, but gradually food became associated with mortification of the flesh and the extinction of all desire in monastic regimes, asceticism. Ecclesiastical regulation prescribed fasting or regulations on food, for example, abstaining from meat on Fridays or fasting during Lent. And yet, medieval elite consumed large quantities of meat, usually served whole and clearly recognizable, and the preparation was public, in part because they feared that they might be poisoned. In the 16th century, monastic food asceticism was criticized. Martin Luther recommended intake of large quantities of food as a remedy against temptation and melancholy. We see a gradual increase in delicacy and sensitivity in meat consumption. Instead of serving whole animals, dissection and consumption began to be separated from one another, increasing the distance between the preparation and the consumption of meat. Turning to modern food ethics, in the 19th century, we see growing importance of the social dimensions of food production and consumption. Malthus' writings on population growth and food production are still of concern to us today, and Karl Marx focused on production of food, saying that food products are incarnations of social tension and conflict. Early posits that food ethics should be important in decision-making of professionals in the food industry today. So, from the new scientific point of view, we want to see systematic observation and quantification. Dietetics becomes both moral, ethical, as well as scientific medical. We rely on exact measurements and labeling practices. Of course, if you think about it, the further away from food production the consumer becomes, the more that they are going to rely on labeling. So when food production is separated from food consumption, you must rely on labels. And nowadays we ask, do labels give information on potential contaminants? Contamination is often phrased as binary. It's problematic or unproblematic, contaminated, uncontaminated. Examples would include people concerned with vegetarianism or vegan, or kosher food. And we have new forms of potential contamination, such as genetically engineered or genetically modified foods, pesticides, preservatives, additives. Additionally, the use of green labels, such as fair trade labels, express moral concern with socio-economic conditions. But even socio-economic conditions aren't enough. Now we add in worries about birds and rainforests and the rest of the world. Zwart argues that the materiality of food has changed. Food has materialized into industrial food products. We have become consumers from a distance. We have lost intimacy with food production, and so we must rely on food labeling. Our reading for today points out how longer food chains are more risky in times of major social disruption, such as the pandemic we are currently experiencing. By accepting certain labels and rejecting others, Zwart says, the contemporary food consumer is allowed to develop a moral self, to live a morally examined life, and to take sides in the political conflicts of the present. That is, if that is a person or a food consumer who has choices. Food systems, as I said before, are wickedly complex. From the food point of view, we can look at them from production, from distribution, from consumption points of view. And of course, these are all situated in social situations. And from the human point of view, we have the international scale, the national scale, regional, local, group, family, and individual. And each of these has different problems associated with food. Your reading for Wednesday is Dixon, Learning to See Food Justice. Dixon asks two questions. Why should we cultivate ethical perception about food justice? And how best should we encourage our students and ourselves to look at the world in a new way? What a person sees as ethically relevant or not will depend on previous experiences and the extent to which she is habituated in the right way. In other words, Dixon says that we need time and experience to see food justice. I've asked you all to relate a story of food injustice that you have witnessed during your life for extra credit to submit before Wednesday's class time. It's called Assignment S1.